Greetings, scholars from the high school library. This is your APUSH review for the midterm, and I'm looking at the review sheet I have given you, and we're going to go from top to bottom. And the first question is, how did religion shape the development of colonial society? And this will be a short answer question for you. And remember, I believe I gave you this year the DBQ, which was asking you to compare the Chesapeake colonies, which would be namely Virginia and Maryland, with the New England colonies, and the focus there would be on Massachusetts. And if you remember what you should have written, Jamestown is settled by a bunch of men looking for gold, whereas Massachusetts is settled by Puritans looking for religious liberty. And in 1620, the Pilgrims land. 1630, you have the Puritans, and they merge into one Massachusetts colony. And what characterizes them is they are Protestants. They are Calvinists. They are those who want to purify the Church of England, which they feel is too Catholic-y. Remember, Henry VIII broke away not for religious reasons, but for that divorce. So these are dissenters, and they are being persecuted by James I and Charles I, who are saying that if you do not have the bishop of the Anglican Church as your bishop, then you don't have him as your king, and you are basically a traitor. And they're being persecuted. They're being fined, they're being whipped, they're being jailed, and they're fleeing to America. And the Church of England is the church they're breaking off from, and the Pilgrims are known as separatists, although the Puritans see themselves as those who want to rejuvenate. They want to purify the Church of England. They ultimately want to stay. Some things that you could put in an essay or a short answer on Massachusetts. The Puritans saw themselves building a city on a hill. This comes from the Sermon on the Mount that Jesus gave, and this is from a sermon Model of Christian Charity by John Winthrop. The Puritans believed in this idea of covenant, that God would reward them. If they were faithful, he would bless their endeavor. The Puritans believed in reading the Bible, knowing the Bible, and for this reason they've set up schools. Under the old Deluder Act, every town of over 50 people was required to set up a school to teach children how to read the Scriptures, where God's truth would be found. The Puritans set up Harvard University, which was actually set up as a divinity school for the training of Puritan ministers. And the Puritans, although they are leaving and undergoing great hardship for religious freedom for themselves, they did not believe in giving religious freedom to others. So they persecuted Quakers. If you were Catholic, you wouldn't think of going to Puritan New England. And you have the Salem witch trials. You have the hanging of Mary Dyer, who's a famous Quaker dissident. Rhode Island, on the other hand, is created for the purpose of separation of church and state by Roger Williams, who is a Puritan minister who gets the heave-ho because he's critical of the treatment of the Indians. He's critical of the acceptance of a charter from the English king, which presupposes that he has some sort of right to allow you to worship in the first place. And but the big thing is there should be no coercion in worship. So he believes in separation of church and state. And of course you have Anne Hutchinson, who is this sort of I don't think it's intentional on her part, but she's sort of a proto-feminist. She is a woman doing something that women are not supposed to do. She's speaking and leading and preaching in a church, and she is teaching antinomianism, which is this idea that we are saved by grace, not by the law. We live by this, the Holy Spirit enlightening us, the Holy Spirit speaking in us. And she and Roger Williams are a threat to the society where you must be compelled to obey the Scriptures, or God's covenant would be broken and you would not be under God's favor. Maryland is settled by Catholics, and the Toleration Act allowed freedom for worship for all who were Trinitarians. Pennsylvania was set up for religious freedom for Quakers, but for all others as well, by William Penn. The Quakers, remember, they're characterized, they have no ministers, they're pacifists, they believed in the equality of women, and they were against slavery. In New York was de facto religious freedom. They're set up by the New York is previously called the New Netherlands, set up by Dutch settlers. And the Dutch are famous for, long before this settling, for their religious tolerance. Gets in the way of trade if you aren't tolerant. And New York has Dutch Calvinists, and they call themselves Reformed with a capital R, but New York becomes a place that has Lutherans, has Anglicans, has all sorts of people, and has a large Jewish community in New York City. How did economic and geographic factors encourage the growth of slavery as part of the economy of the southern colonies? Well, you have the need for cheap labor, and at first the southern colonies are going to go with indentures. These are servants that are on typically a 7-year contract. But after Bacon's rebellion in 1676, the indentures are not to be trusted. It was freed indentures. It was freed poor white men on the frontier that marched on Jamestown and burned it, this big protest that was Bacon's rebellion. So they're going to go the more guaranteed route of increasing the amount of slaves. And slavery starts very early, 1619, the same year that the House of Burgesses is set up in Jamestown. So the need, this huge need for labor in a land where there was just endless amount of work to do. But geographically, the southern colonies, or the Chesapeake colonies in particular at this time, although the question doesn't say that, so we can include the Carolinas here in Georgia. The soil here is very good along the coast for farming tobacco and rice and indigo. And after 1793, and this is important, after the Revolutionary War, cotton will grow in importance after the invention of the cotton gin by Eli Whitney. But the geographic factors will retard the growth of slavery in the North because it's not as profitable to have slaves working on smaller, more subsistence-type farms in, say, New England. What was the impact of Atlantic trade routes on economic development in British North America? You should be familiar with the triangular trade. This is the shipping of slaves from Africa to the Caribbean to grow molasses, to grow sugar, and sugar or molasses is shipped up to New England, where it's turned into rum, which is shipped back to Africa. So you have this trade that goes back and forth between the Americas and Africa. And, if you were ever to see a map or something that talks about a leg going up, say, to Europe, to England, and then down to Africa, don't get too confused by this. The principle here is that trade is going back and forth. Mercantilism is the system where the government is regulating trade, and the goal is a favorable balance of trade. You're selling more than you're buying. Money's not leaking out of your country. The Navigation Acts were orders, was a law telling the Americans they could only trade on British ships, and because Britain has a revolution between Parliament and King Charles I, and later on there's a whole bunch of wars with France, there is this negligence in sort of keeping order in America, and the Americans become, I'm going to use the word de facto independent. They're making their own laws, they're electing their own legislators, they are worshiping freely, and they're trading freely. They're basically ignoring all of these Mercantile Navigation Act rules, and this is called the salutary neglect. Salutary means healthy, so it's a neglect which we're enjoying, and it's this neglect which will end, which will lead to the Revolutionary War. Enumerated goods are those specific goods we were forbidden to sell to other countries. How did each of the below lead to the American Revolution? Parliamentary taxation, 1763, after this stunning victory in the French and Indian War, where Britain wins essentially all of Canada and the disputed land in the Ohio River Valley. The plan here is to tax the Americans to pay for a debt which has been accumulated, and what's going to happen is the colonial legislatures, which have been taxing themselves, are being bypassed, and this cry goes up, no taxation without representation, and cries from guys like Patrick Henry in the House of Burgesses, give me liberty or give me death. You should be familiar with some of these taxes which were imposed upon us without our consent: the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Act, the Tea Act, etc. Restrictions on civil liberties. Civil liberties refer to individual freedom, the freedom of your property and your body. You have writs of assistance, where these are search warrants, where customs officials would go into your property, into your home, into your business, looking for smuggled goods, looking for contraband. You have the Quartering Act, forcing soldiers into private homes. You have military courts which are bypassing a jury of your peers. You have the Intolerable Acts, which shut down the port of Boston and block trade. British military measures. You have this forcing the support of troops which are not asked for long after the French and Indian War is over, and there's no danger of Indian attacks along the East Coast. And you have the Boston Massacre in 1770. You have Lexington and Concord and Bunker Hill. These are major battles which are fought before the Declaration of Independence is declared July 4, 1776. Lexington and Concord and Bunker Hill take place in 1775. Religious ideas, you could point to the Great Awakening. Now, this is happening, a good maybe 30 years before the Revolutionary War, but the Great Awakening is a rebellion against state churches, against colonial established churches, the Anglican Church in the South and the Congregationalist Church in New England. And what's happening here, by rebelling against a state church, you're rebelling against the authority of that state government. And I would liken this to practice revolution. The vocabulary, the rhetoric of freedom and liberty and tyranny is being thrown around referring to religious life, and this is going to be just a step away from applying it to the coming unjust taxes. Political ideas, well, remember the colonists believed in self-government. This is an old English idea that comes out of the Magna Carta, out of the Petition of Right, out of the Bill of Rights, and this is all Bill of Rights in England, which precedes ours. And you have John Locke and the Enlightenment, and John Locke is this guy who says that we are born with natural rights. We're born free, and we give up some of our freedom to set up a government to protect the rest of our rights, and if the government's not doing this job, we have the right, in fact, we have the duty to rebel. The Articles of Confederation, successes, well, the successes is the colonies turn over their western lands to this Articles of Confederation Congress, and that diffuses some of the arguments over this western land. 1785, you have a land ordinance which is going to distribute and dispose of this land in a very coherent, orderly, reasonable way. Townships are going to be set up 6 miles by 6 miles. 1787, you have the Northwest Ordinance, which is going to have a plan for statehood on an equal footing. 5,000 people in a territory can have self-government, and 60,000 people can set up a constitution and apply to the Congress for entry into the United States as a state. Problems, we went over this in class. There's no president. There is no independent chief executive. There is no national court system. There's trade conflicts between states, no way to resolve them. There's no army. There's no way to force states to pay up their taxes. There's debt, there's inflation, and the system is stagnant, and you can't change it. Essentially, you can't change it. You can't change it easily. It takes a 13 out of 13 vote to change the articles. And perhaps worst of all, as far as foreign relations, foreigners don't just not fear us, but they disrespect us. The Spanish have a fort in Natchez on the Mississippi in our territory. The Brits have forts still in the West. We're being shut out of the Caribbean, and things are just, things are a mess if you're looking at us as a country. Keep in mind, on the state level, there is government, self-government, and there is freedom. And most people are seeing themselves more as members of a state than as a national government. Thus the rub. Washington's administration, after the Constitution is ratified in 1788, there's an election. Washington wins all the electoral votes. When he comes into office, he puts Hamilton in as his Secretary of Treasury, and you have this 3-part plan. You have a tariff to protect domestic native infant industry. You have the pay down of the debt, and you have the assumption bill that takes up the state debts along with the national debt, and in return, the southern states who had been paying on their debt, they will get a capital in the South on the Potomac and a new District of Columbia. And thirdly, you have a Bank of the United States. The purpose is to collect capital and to promote industrial growth. Whiskey Rebellion is a contrast with Shays Rebellion. Remember, one of the problems with the Articles is there wasn't an army. You couldn't put down rebellion, and the farmers in western Massachusetts rebel against what they see as unfair taxes by the Boston government, and it takes the raising of essentially sort of a private army to put down these citizen farmer soldiers. And the plan here is, in the new government, the president has the right to put down domestic insurrection and rebellion. And Washington does this when a whiskey tax is passed. There's rebellion in western Pennsylvania. Washington marches an army down and he suppresses this rebellion nonviolently. Some treaties to know. Jay's Treaty, essentially a renewed peace treaty with Great Britain. They agree to leave our forts, and we agree to press the states to pay the Tory loyalists back. Pinckney's Treaty, also called the Treaty of San Lorenzo, opens up the Mississippi River for the right of deposit at New Orleans, which is controlled at this time by Spain. The Treaty of Greenville is going to be a treaty with the Indians that basically gives us Ohio. The Neutrality Act of 1795 is going to keep us out of European conflicts and entanglements, and this is a reneging on the French alliance. And remember, they've got a war going on with the rest of Europe. This is about 6 years deep into the French Revolution, but we're not going to be drawn into this. So Washington is keeping us out of foreign affairs. President's here. The president's called Mr. President. He's not, called King Washington. And he serves 2 terms, and he steps down and he goes back to home to Mount Vernon, creating this precedent which lasts all through U.S. history with the exception of FDR. States' rights, this is a concept that the states are essentially still sovereign, that they can overrule the national government if they feel the national government is doing something unconstitutional. And the Anti-Federalists are the early states' writers. These are the people that did not want a constitution in the first place. They feared setting up a Frankenstein. They feared setting up this monstrous big government when they just threw off the yoke of King George and the British government. The Alien and Sedition Acts are passed by are passed under John Adams, and what they do is they punish criticism of the government. And this Federalist government is putting Republican editors and journalists into jail, and Virginia and Kentucky will pass resolutions saying they will not obey. The Hartford Convention, 1815. Trade has been slammed on the East Coast here during the War of 1812, and there's discussion in Hartford, Connecticut by some Federalist delegates about whether or not the New Englanders should withdraw. Tariff of Abominations, 1832. South Carolina is going to nullify the federal tariff. They say they will not collect it, and you have this showdown, remember, between John C. Calhoun, who published Exposition and Protest, talking about the idea of nullification. And Jackson will do 2 things. He will get a force bill passed threatening to invade South Carolina, and a reduction of the tariff, which is the carrot approach. Election of 1860, the South will pull out. They will pull the ultimate, card here, and that is that they have the right to leave the Union because the North is, hostile to them. Lincoln, they don't trust him. Growth in the early 1850s, the impact of the agricultural developments. One thing to point to would be Eli Whitney and the cotton gin, which is going to increase the demand for slavery and cotton, and there'll be this relentless pushing west for more cotton land. Transportation improvements, you have canals, most famous being the 363-mile Erie Canal that will connect the Great Lake system with the Hudson River and thus New York City. You have the building of toll roads, these turnpikes. You have in the 1820s the first railroads, and you have with Fitch and Fulton the first steamboats, and Fulton has the first paying passenger steam ferry. But steamboats become real important on the western rivers, getting up these long rivers, the Ohio, the Mississippi. These are rivers that are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miles long. So this will be important for increasing trade in the West. Manufacturing, you can point to Sam Slater, the first textile mill. Point to Eli Whitney again with the cotton gin and interchangeable parts. As far as immigration goes, there's the wave of Irish that come over, but there's also Germans, and this is a period before the end of the Civil War. We're looking at Western Europeans. Later, these will be called the old immigrants. The new immigrants at the tail end of the 1800s, early 1900s, will be from Eastern Europe. Those will be Jews and Italians and Poles and people from the Russian Empire. But these immigrants between 1800 and 1860 are essentially Germans, Irish, more English and Scots and Welsh, and you're going to have some Dutch and Scandinavians. These are the Western Europeans, if you can pull down that map of Western Europe in your mind. I'm flipping pages here if you're watching this. The Jacksonian Democrats, and I gave you a question on how democratic were they, and were they truly guardians of the Constitution? And Jackson felt that he was. His plan was to kill, and he does kill, the Bank of the United States. He will have a record number of vetoes. He feels he's the tribune, the representative of the common people against a perhaps spendthrift Congress. And he vetoes the Maysville Road. And this is a famous road which will be built entirely within one state. And he feels that's not the government's business. Guardians of political democracy, there's the end of the property requirement to vote. Jackson does not specifically do this, but this happens around the nation during this time period. The number of men voting doubles within just the Jackson time period here. It might be noted here, by the end of the first decade of the 1800s, this is pre-Jackson, but slavery ends in all of the northern states. Slavery will be eradicated. As far as guardians of economic opportunity, you could talk about this period of economic expansion. And here you get back into talking about railroads and canals and roads. And you might point to some earlier Supreme Court decisions, Gibbons versus Ogden, saying that only Congress has the right to restrict interstate trade, Dartmouth versus Woodward, upholding the sanctity of contracts, and Charles River versus the Warren Bridge, looking at the greater common, what's better for the common good here regarding this free public bridge versus the toll bridge. People who are not benefiting by this Jacksonian democracy, these would, of course, be women. Remember the protest 1848 at Seneca Falls. And remember that slavery is increasing and growing and expanding. And, of course, the Indians in the famous Indian Removal Act of 1830 and the Trail of Tears. What was the Second Great Awakening? This is a revival in the early 1800s. It's very Arminian, not Armenian, but Arminian, which means that we choose God. We choose to be saved. We open the door of our hearts and invite Christ in. Very un-Calvinist, and this is very optimistic, and it matches the tenor of the times. And Americans become very confident that they can eradicate other evils, such as, at least Northerners, some Northerners, abolition. You have women's rights. You have the temperance movement. You have utopian communities. You have what's called millennialism, this idea of ushering in the kingdom of Christ's rule. You have the Millerites. You have the Amana community, the Oneida community, the Shakers. You have the Mormons, and this is not a Christian group, but they are a sort of a quasi-Christian group. You have Brook Farm, and this one is not religious. These are a bunch of transcendentalists living on a communal farm in Massachusetts. And so I'm giving you sort of the, I'm mentioning these groups. It's up to you to be sure to look in your notes to be sure to, get more details on what these groups were and what they planned to do. How did Western expansion strain national unity between 1800 and 1860? Louisiana, purchased in 1803 from Napoleon by Thomas Jefferson, was opposed by some New Englanders, namely the Essex Junto, because they predicted these states would become Republican states, that the Federalists would not see their party spread. And they were very prescient, and this does happen. And remember, during the era of good feelings, the Federalist Party dies, not because of Louisiana Purchase, but namely because they were disloyal during the War of 1812. Missouri asked to come in as a state, the first state in this Louisiana acquisition. 1820, the Talmadge Amendment proposes that the children of slaves should be freed. This does not pass, and Missouri, there's a compromise, and that's that Missouri comes in slave, Maine comes in as a free state, and 3630, the south line of Missouri, becomes the dividing line all the way to the western limit of Louisiana Purchase. South of it is slavery, north of it there is no slavery. Texas fights and wins their independence in 1836. The North does not want Texas coming into the country. The fear is not only will it be a slave state, but that it perhaps will be divided up into a number of slave states. So it's not until 1845 that Texas is annexed, and this will lead to war in 1846 over where the Texas border is. This war will be won very handily in 2 years. The Mexicans will cede what's called the Mexican Cession. And then the argument will be what happens with this land once California wants in 1850. And you have the Wilmot Proviso, where David Wilmot from Pennsylvania will get the House to pass a prohibition of slavery in the Mexican Cession, doesn't pass the Senate. Compromise is worked out, the Compromise of 1850, and that is there will be popular sovereignty in the West, a strict Fugitive Slave Act, the end of the slave trade in D.C., and California will come in free. As far as Kansas, 1854, the Kansas and Nebraska territories are opened to popular sovereignty. Stephen Douglas is finagling to get Southern support for a railway, which will have as its terminus Chicago. This railway will pass through the Kansas-Nebraska territories, and the South wants some quid pro quo. Northerners see this as a violation of the Missouri Compromise, which was 34 years earlier, and the North sees this as a betrayal, and there's a sort of mini Civil War preview, an introduction to the war in Kansas between the slavers and the free soilers, and you have John Brown, the Potawatomi Massacre, the burning of Lawrence, two competing legislatures at Compton and Topeka. Women, Republican motherhood is the idea that women should raise little patriot kids. Cult of domesticity says women should stay home and raise little patriotic, moral Christian kids. They should tend, not the kids, but the women should tend hearth and home. What caused these ideas to grow? The growth of industrialization took men out of the home. And ideally, the woman is staying home and she's, cooking and cleaning and what have you, taking care of the children. And this becomes, even today perhaps, a very middle-class ideal, the stay-at-home wife that does not have to work. Was this the reality for all women? No. Poor women, if you are lower in class, if you're a poor immigrant or perhaps a member of the Lowell Farm Girls, these poor young women are working in factories, not because they necessarily want to. You have slave women who are working in the fields and they're working as domestics, and certainly they don't want to. So you have a lot of women who are working. This middle class idea is, for many women, bogus. How did African Americans shape the course of the Civil War in the South? Secession is for the purpose of protecting slavery. We need to be very clear on this. The South does not secede because of taxation. Don't confuse the secession in 1860 and 61 with the Tariff of Abominations, the tariff controversy of 1832. If you read, and we did this in class, if you read the Declaration of Causes of leaving the Union, of secession for South Carolina, there is no mention of taxation and big government. It's 100% criticism of abolitionism, a criticism of the Republican Party, of Northern criticism of slavery. I mean, it's on and on and on. It's all about slavery. Slave codes, you have the fear of revolt after Nat Turner's revolt in 1831 and Harper's Ferry in 1859. And there is this real strict legal system forbidding the freeing of slaves, of teaching slaves, of slaves traveling without permission, preaching without permission, and possessing guns and possessing musical instruments that they might make signals with. And there's this fear of Lincoln. There's this fear that the slaves are poised to rebel and Northerners are agitating. As far as the North goes, the Republican platform is to stop the spread of slavery in the West. Be very clear, the Republicans originally do not plan to end slavery, certainly not in the South until we get to the Emancipation Proclamation Act of January 1, 1863. The border states, early on in the war, Lincoln is treating the border states with kid gloves. These are the 4 slave states that stay with the Union, that do not join the South. That's Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. The Confiscation Act, 61 and 62, the Congress, the Republican Congress, passes a law liberating slaves that are that are supporting the war effort. They're contraband. They're like weapons. They're the slaves that are carting goods and cooking food and washing clothes and whatever. They are liberated if they're captured by the Northern Army, and there's a lot of self-liberation as slaves are freeing to Union lines. The Emancipation Proclamation will free all the slaves in areas of rebellion. Keep in mind, does not free the slaves in the border states or in southern Louisiana, which was freed very early in the war. The purpose here is to throw a monkey wrench into the Southern war machine. Black soldiers are enlisted, starting with the Emancipation Proclamation. Approximately 10% of the Northern Army, between 180 to 200,000 soldiers, will fight. And if some of you have seen the movie Glory, that shows you one of these regiments from Massachusetts that will be fighting in the Civil War, and these are black soldiers. Reconstruction is this period of rebuilding the nation. Some permanent changes are the Civil Rights Amendments. You need to have these memorized. 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. 14th Amendment gives citizenship to all Americans born in the United States. And you can read, for our purposes, this is referring at the time to black freedmen, to black Americans. 15th Amendment gives voting rights to all American citizens. And what doesn't change? Well, politically, you have laws passed to restrict voting. Felony laws, if you're a felon, if you don't have a job and you're a vagrant and you're walking around, well, you've just committed a felony, you're stripped from voting for the rest of your life. In Florida, where this is coming from, you have, I'm guessing maybe 600 to 800,000 Floridians with felony records who can't vote, and disproportionately many of them are African Americans. You have literacy tests to keep people from voting. If you can't pass the test, you don't vote. A poll tax, you don't pay the tax, you don't vote. Grandfather clause, if your grandfather could vote, you could vote. Well, your grandfather can't vote, then of course you can't either. And the guarantee here is the Ku Klux Klan, which will threaten to kill and to destroy your property if you try to vote. Socially, you've got black codes, which are an extension or successor to the slave codes. These are all these rules of what you can and can't do regarding your your white your white neighbor, your white boss. You can't, perhaps can't travel if you're employed without permission. You can't leave without permission if you have signed a contract. Any arguments over the contract, you have to, the white boss make the decision. You can't sue a white. You can't serve on a jury. These restrictions. Jim Crow is the successor to the black codes. This is racial segregation where blacks and whites are not socially intermingling in places like restaurants and waiting rooms and train stations and inside of a railway car. Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896, will uphold separate but equal is okay as long as blacks have schools, as long as they have a way of getting on a railway car. They can be separated as long as they're treated equally. At least this goes all the way until 1954 Brown Supreme Court decision. Economically, what doesn't change is you have economic dependence on former white plantation owners, white farmers. Sharecropping is where the whites can't pay you money and you don't have land, so you're working for a cut of the crop. And tenancy is a term, I don't know if we went over this in class. A tenant is somebody who pays rent. So you're renting land from a white person. But the problem here is if you don't own land, you become economically dependent, and you have to please the guy who's, giving you the land or renting it to you, and perhaps loaning you things like a plow and a mule and seed and food until the crop comes in. Problems for whites in the South. There's a lot of sharecropping for Southern whites as well, and many Southern whites, these, if you're an upper class white, you look at these poor redneck hillbilly crackers as, they really shouldn't be voting either. So there's discrimination against poor whites as well, and by some of the means that are keeping blacks disenfranchised. The West, causes of development. You have technology, railroads, you have railways being built, you have barbed wire, fencing and cattle, you have windmills pumping water from deep in the ground, far away from where there's rivers. Wars and treaty, you could talk about the Louisiana Purchase, the Oregon Treaty, Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the Gadsden Purchase. All of these are cementing all those pieces in the West. You could even throw in things like the Convention of 1818 with that 49th parallel. These are all things you could toss in. Types of settlers, you have farmers, you have cowboys, you have miners. Later on, you have lumberjacks. For religion, you have got Mormons going to Utah on the Great Trek after Joseph Smith is assassinated, and they're being led by Brigham Young. Opportunities, you have cowboys. Opportunities for different people, and these aren't in any particular order of importance, but you have cowboys, and you could talk about the long drive, moving longhorns to cow towns like Abilene, Texas, where the railways would ship them to the processing plants, places like Chicago and Kansas City and St. Louis. You have farmers. You have the Homestead Act giving 160 acres for anyone who will stay for 5 years. You have the exodusters. These are black farmers who will flee the South to get free land in the West. You have the building of railroads. You have you can talk about the Pacific Railway Act of 1862. You can talk about the Chinese workers moving from the West. The AP likes details like that. You could talk about miners. You could talk about the gold rush in California, the 49ers. You could talk about Comstock Lode, gold and silver mines in places like Nevada and in Colorado. Lacking opportunities, well, the Indians. The Indians are getting the short end of the stick here. The Indians, tossed west by Jackson. They're ultimately going to get the boot from Oklahoma Indian Territory. They're going to lose the Black Hills, and they're going to be stuck on reservations, and eventually even those reservations will be divided up under the Dawes Severalty Act, and the reservations will be put back together in 1934 after about 2/3 of the reservation land is lost. So this is your quick drive-by review. Do look over this. Everything on here reflects something that will be on the exam, and you certainly want to know details. So there you have it. Signing off from the library. Study well, study smart, and study hard.